Hello and welcome to Roadmap 2023, our election issues and personalities tracking program. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. Thanks for being with us. My guest on today's episode says with the 2023 general election now over, one of the most important things to do is to identify key lessons from the exercise with a view to using them to significantly improve future elections. My guest also believes that the nation's governance process will obviously benefit from such an activity. Roadmap 2023 talks to analyst and professor of political science, Jideofor Adibe. Professor Jideofor Adibe, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
We are done now with this particular election cycle, the 2023 general elections. But some of the reports that have come out, even though they are still preliminary, have indicated that, like most other election cycles, this has been a mixed bag. While there has been commendation for INEC on some respects, there's also been criticism and then, of course, concern over the issue of violence. Depending on whose report you believe, anywhere from 20 to 28 people were killed just in the governorship and National Assembly election cycle alone. What's your own take of this complete election cycle?
Well, I think we were probably too quick in believing that Beavers has become a game changer and that people's votes will count. It will seem as if the politicians very quickly went back to the drawing boards. And what happened at the gubernatorial and state assembly elections in some states, in many states, was simply a sham. The whole thing that we thought we had left behind, issue of ballot box snatching, issue of changing figures at the collation centers, they all surfaced. So allegations are everywhere. And even though there were serious complaints at the presidential election, when we look at what happened on 25th February in relation to what happened recently, it just, the 25th February started to look good, which is really a shame. I think suddenly people are beginning to ask questions between Professor Mahmoud's INEC and Maurice Iwu's INEC, which one is more credible? That's to show you the extent to which we have sunk. And people that are believing that our votes are going to begin to count, many of them are disappointed. And if you look around you, there's a deep sense of despondency across the board. And people are beginning to wonder whether this liberal democracy is worth it, or whether we are just in the era of gangster democracy.
Given that situation, there are those, of course, who have pointed out that on the other hand, if you take the two sets of elections together, the presidential and national assembly, and then the governorship and the state assemblies, they've produced a couple of shocks. You and I and a couple of others have discussed at length already the shocks that came out of the presidential election. But in the case of the governorship elections, we must, of course, emphasize that at this point, some of those elections are first undecided. I think about 3 or so states, they are undecided. And then in many of the other states, there are serious contentions over the outcome. But there have also been a few surprises in some of those areas. Do you think this in any way was influenced by the voting process or by a new pattern that was introduced by what those who are familiar with it are calling the third force?
Well, if you look at the first, the National Assembly election, we had 8 political parties getting people into the National Assembly. How many political parties? Now is still predominantly 2 or 3. I'm not sure. I think my own conclusion is that the fact of the shocks, especially as we witnessed during the 25th February, they do not in themselves remove the fact of manipulations, because you had almost nearly 177,000 polling units, and there is an extent to which you can manipulate. But what seems to be very discernible in this round was the outright changing of our figures. or allegations of outright changing of figures. And there are instances, for example, if you look at Imo State, it is just, even Imo people will tell you it's incredulous that there will be 25 over 25. All the 25 members of the APC got elected. At the time, the popular sentiments in the streets, were elsewhere. And you can extrapolate from there to other places. I think my own reading of the situation is that the politicians went back to the drawing board. And if you look at the people that survived in the national election on 25th February, especially to the national legislature, there were people you conclude had rough edges and were able to rough it out in terms of ability to deploy violence, ability to deploy cash. They were, some of them are the ones that survived. So they were taken on our ways, as some of them confessed. And this time around, how many governors, sitting governors, were upstaged? So the element of surprise, the politicians quickly regrouped, and they came in another way. And I think this is across the country. I will not limit it to any particular area. Across the country, you see extra, people, vote buying was literally taken to a different height. Violence was deployed, and it's just unfortunate because people are despondent. I'm not sure the enthusiasm that mobilized especially our young ones into taking active interest in the process, whether we are going to be able to get such enthusiasm back again. Those enthusiasm was already doused by the way INEC organized the election of 25th February. And then you had a lower voter turnout. And then what happened again happened. I'm not really sure. People are beginning to wonder whether the investments in these elections are worth it. Since in the final analysis, most of the outcomes would then seem not to reflect the people's wish.
There is a complication when you talk about voter turnout, because even though, as you have referenced, the voter turnout has dropped, almost with each preceding election cycle, starting from 1999, but that the introduction of technology, first the smart card reader and then subsequently the Beavers machine, has meant that, quite a lot of the shenanigans that were going on that may have influenced the voter turnout before, when, not exactly possible this time around. That so when we talk about voter turnout, perhaps, we should look at it from the background that a lot of those who are, now registered to vote and who had been previously registered, were non-existent, and that they themselves were those who swelled the voters' register and affected what we have as voter turnout numbers. What do you think?
No, you're partly right, but we have to look at collection of PVCs. If you look at the total number of PVCs collected, they were quite high, and they wouldn't have been collected by ghosts or by people who did double registration in the previous, cycles. So something happened, and the more people believe that their votes do not count, or will not count, or that violence is the order of the day, which was actually what happened during the first two cycles in this dispensation. In 1999 and 2003, it was a lot of violence. People were being killed, up to 2007. And we thought at a point from Jegano that it was very, very perfect. With the introduction of the card reader, there were efforts to checkmate, some of those excesses and loopholes. And then came the Beavers. When they were experimented at Oshun, Anambra, and Ekiti, people came to believe, perhaps too quickly, that the votes were going to count. We saw how the politicians became extremely smart. In Lagos State, it was voter suppression at a level we never saw before. It has always been there in Lagos State, especially. And of course in other parts of the country, but more especially in Lagos State, where every election cycle is weaponized. And then in the 18th March election, it became generalized across the country. Those politicians that felt they lost face, especially sitting governors and others, they went back to the drawing board, took control of the process, and you can see that virtually all the candidates they supported came out victorious. Those who were not on the ballot, those they supported came out victorious. And there were a lot of complaints. Of course, we know in our own system, the people who are on the losing side are hardly magnanimous. They hardly concede. But in this case, from situation reports, it's not a very nice thing. We've had stories of people in anger tearing their passports, which is not the right thing to do, by the way. I'm not sure of people who are coming out with hooray, apart from those who were declared winners. The people who are thinking in terms of the evolution of our democracy. I'm not sure about how many that are coming up and saying, yes, we are making progress. We are making progress to the extent that we have not become like other countries where at the end of the election we count the number of deaths in thousands. But that's not our aspiration. We've gone through that route, and hopefully we were expecting something better. Whether that thing has occurred across, there are a few states where it will seem that the process went on smoothly. States like Bauchi, for example. And there are several others across the country where politicians, just taught us that they will always be one step ahead the electoral umpire.
That leaves us with a burning question now. Some of the reports that I've read, preliminary reports by some of the election observers, have said that the elections of 25th created a trust deficit once we had the problem of uploading results onto the IREF portal, which had been promised, but didn't really happen as had been promised. That trust deficit was there going into the March 18th elections. That was further eroded by what has been described by, in some of the ways that you have already described it in quite a number of states in the Federation, voter suppression, voter intimidation, violence, and all of that. That has also affected the trust deficit even further. So if we are to go further, because the elections don't end with this season, there are more elections coming. There are 3 off-cycle elections for which preparations must now begin to be made later on this year and early next year in Imo, in Bayelsa, and I believe in Kogi. So, I mean, where does that leave the electoral management body now if, as you say, the situation is that a huge trust deficit has now been opened between them and the voting public?
Well, it is, being very skeptical about the entire democratic process, and not democratic process as a whole, but our elections. Whether elections as a process of leadership recruitment is worth the investment. So that's one thing. And then there's a complete loss of trust in INEC. And of course, the position of being an INEC chairman is like a poison chalice. No one ever went into, became INEC chairman and came out unscattered, except Professor Tahiru Jega. And that was largely because Dr. Goodluck Jonathan considered defeat. So we do know it's a poison chalice, but it has not been helped by the way the current INEC organized things. There are several things they could have done in terms of managing optics, which they didn't do. So INEC as presently constituted, I'm not sure they have enough legitimacy to organize future elections. But INEC is only a part of the problem. There is also the problem of our politicians. The beavers, beavers, I believe, is a good technology that ought to have been able to help us. If the uploading of results at the polling unit, immediately elections are concluded, if they were done, if such things were done, maybe, perhaps, some of the loss of confidence in the body could not have happened. If INEC had responded differently to situations, you see, for example, trying to use MCO, Luomo Transport Management Committee to carry out sensitive materials. Why should INEC wait until Labour Party and the others had to go to court to get an injunction. Why is it that they requested for the transfer of a resident electoral commissioner that was accused of bias? What would it have cost them? And then if you look at the day of the announced the outcome of the presidential election, and people were bringing complaints, he kept saying, okay, we'll look into it, and you never looked into it, you just declared the elections by 3 a.m. So there are a number of things. It is possible that, that all those malfeasances and shortcomings could not have affected the outcome. But it is part of the process, transparency of the process, that could have engendered more confidence in the system. And it didn't happen. And if I were Professor Mahmoud, he should simply resign. It's either complicity or incompetence. And that is one part of the problem, in my own opinion. Then we come around to the issue of, because it's a multi-stakeholder operation, the issue of security agencies, this issue of governors behaving like emperors. And apparently the security agencies will be looking the other way around, while they deploy violence, intimidation to change the results. And we also have to look into some of the resident electoral commissioners, whether they were complicit in some of the things that happened at various states, or whether it is just a question of the normal allegations by people who were not favored by the electoral outcome. Whatever it is, I would like to see at the end of this election an independent body auditing INEC, just doing probing the operation of INEC and auditing its processes. I had already, in different occasions, argued that we should start thinking of unbundling INEC, or even getting professionals who have enough experience in the management of projects to run organizations like INEC. But I do think that we have to have a way of engendering confidence, bringing back confidence in the fact that our votes will count, and that it is worth people's effort to go and queue up, stay hours in the queue just to exercise their franchise. And in the end, they feel that the outcome does not reflect, what happened at the polling unit.
You talked about the cost of or the investment in this election cycle. This particular one, at least by what was appropriated, cost us well over 300 billion naira. And that, of course, does not include the appropriations for other services that were, directly and indirectly related to the elections. But people talk about wastage. And one of the things that they brought up was the issue of ballot papers. And that relates to the voter turnout issue we discussed earlier. That we waste a lot of money in putting together materials because the election management body has to make provision for all those who have PVCs and all those who may have wanted to vote under the rules and regulations guiding. And that at the end of the day, if we had almost 90 million people with PVCs and then only 24 million people voted, we can do the calculation of how many ballot papers have been wasted, not to talk about all the other ancillary. Is there a way out of this? Because each time this happens, we ask the question and we are told that's the provision of the law. So there's no way out of it.
I think so. Actually, people who are more tech savvy can take it up. But I do believe, for example, that since we have our own biometric details in a database, do we really need this paper PVC to vote? I don't think so. I believe people who are, the tech people will be able to provide answers for that. I also think, for example, that private sector operators should start thinking of investing. For example, instead of having party agents, a political party having to pay, you can imagine 176,000 polling units, and you have to have at least one polling agent in each. That will cost you a lot of money. You can think of private firms that can be set up and registered, maybe 2 or 3 of them, and during the time of elections, they will represent political parties. You pay in a chunk of money to them, and they will cover your interest, so that at the end of the day, they have their own servers, they are uploading, and INEC is uploading its own. It becomes a matter of cross-checking the different databases. And obviously, if you have about 3 companies doing the same thing, with time, the ones that are more credible will emerge. Those are dodgy that will fizzle out. In that way, you save political parties money from having to hire agents. You have to save them the potential of being victims of violence and others. And also in that way, people will have at least 2, 3 databases to look at almost in real time, because while INEC has to wait until the conclusion of election before they can upload to IREF, I'm sure tech companies will be able to upload in real time, so that once you vote, it comes up onto a server. So that in that way, this idea of changing the results, or allegations of changing the result, will be able to overcome it. And then it's becoming a joke now that people will do something, people will commit acts of impunity, and they will ask you to go to court. Because that's what INEC will tell you, and others will tell you, well, if you're not happy with the process, go to the courts. And I'm not sure really it helps, because we're also assuming wrongly that there is an implicit confidence in our judicial system. The judiciary is a reflection of the society, and as you rightly pointed out, there is a trust deficit across board. Just as people do not trust INEC, several people do not also trust the judiciary. They believe the judiciary is commoditized, and that even though that the symbol is that of a blindfolded, person, people will argue that sometimes it has a torchlight moving around. We don't know. These are allegations. But what we do know is that we are a low-trust society, and the conduct of these elections recently is not going to help, has not helped to improve the trust among Nigerians, or the trust in the institutions of the state.
That has brought, of course, the judiciary into the spotlight. And even though you did say, oh, these are allegations and so on, the judiciary has come up over the years with some very contentious judgments, which people have subjected to a great deal of analysis and said that they don't stand up to scrutiny. In the case of the lower courts, they've come up with very contentious judgments, which higher courts have then gone on to overturn. In the case of, in some of the other cases, even the very highest court has come up with some fairly contentious decisions. But so in terms of the judiciary, when people say, if you're not happy with the process, go to court, so many people seem to be very cautious about approaching the courts. Although for this process, we can say that, many of the leading contending parties have already headed in the direction of the court. Over the presidential election, many of those who participated in the governorship are going to the courts, and they've said they are going to go. Does this for you mean that, the courts, or is it a question of, well, what options do we have? If we don't go to court, what else are we to do?
Well, I would like to believe that there are still some people within the judiciary, just as we have within the larger Nigerian society. Even within the INEC, there are still people who want to do the right thing. So you go there with the blind belief that maybe you will encounter such people. But I think also most people, or many people now, when they go into court, is because there's no other alternative. You can't take the laws into your hand. There is a very funny thing on the internet going on about people in a swimming competition. And instead of swimming, one of the competitors ran to the end of the swimming pool, jumped in, and came first and said, look, we can go to court. So that tells you how people take the process.
Yes,
and say, declare me, and he can go to court if you don't like it. So that's where we are today, and it's not a laughing matter. It's very funny. But each time we do things, each time we overlook things like that, we say, let's move on. And we don't try to interrogate the process. We don't try to punish people. We don't try to set record. Everybody is now concerned, let's forge ahead. It is God's will. Take you, for example, what happened in Lagos, why people are profiling a certain ethnic group. People do not sit back to think of the consequences. Because you felt a particular candidate was humiliated in Lagos on 25th February, you have now some people some of them, parading themselves as intellectuals, people like Bayo Onanuga, FFK, and the rest of them, you go inciting people, saying, Igbos leave. Now, what is the subtext to this? Is that Abuja that you are asking Asiwaju to come to has indigenes, and they are listening. It is also that many big-time investors in Lagos, the Dangotes, they are listening, and they are saying, well, ultimately, is my investment safe here? And it reminds us again of, you remember that Lutheran pastor from Germany during the Civil War, who was a Nazi sympathizer. Yeah. And he eventually ended up spending years in Nazi camp. And when, at the end of the war, he went around giving speech, he said, oh, first they came for the socialists. I didn't do anything because I was not a socialist. Then they came for trade unionists. I didn't say anything because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't do anything because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody to rescue me. So that is the thing that we don't think through. The people that perpetrated such, they are walking around free, no punishment, nothing about consequences, nothing about sanction. And then we are just saying, let's move on. It is the act of God, and the thing is swept under the carpet. When the consequences start now to dawn on us, we begin now to treat it as a fresh problem. You have now from Lagos told Abuja indigenes that at a point you can demand that if people do not know their political preference, they can ask everybody to leave. And that's what's happening. That's the message, the coded message. And from Abuja, it can go to other places in the country. And we are pretending that something serious has not happened. That's not the way. You cannot just put it under the, and then just believe that nothing will happen. So it is the urchins, the innocent people who are unemployed in the street that will go around. But I do know that they don't represent the opinion of the Yorubas. Certainly not the people I know. So, but these are the kind of things we have to deal with. And when I talk about bigotry, I'm not talking of only those talking about Yoruba land, I'm talking about Igbo. We have to condemn bigotry wherever it rears its head. And we deal with it as a problem. Not just to say because, okay, I've now won, let us move forward. I don't think you will move forward without dealing with the problems.
Yeah, but then that leaves the question of how do we deal with the problem? Because a number of people have said what you said, which is that the consequences of what had transpired in some areas, which led to voter suppression, led to voter intimidation, will not end with this election cycle. So even if we move on, as quite a number of people are saying that we should try to, if we just move on, those consequences will also move on with us. So how do we go about addressing things in such a way that perhaps we may not have that outcome now? Because whether you and I like it or not, some people are in office, some people are going to take over that office, pending whatever decisions the courts come to as to the propriety or otherwise of the electoral process. What are those people to do now? What are those in office and those coming into office to do, to mitigate the impact of what has already happened? That's quite apart from looking for those who perpetrated those actions and bringing them to book.
Yes, I agree with you. For example, Bola Tinubu, the president-elect, Bola Tinubu, he issued a letter recently calling for reconciliation. This is something he should have done earlier at the height of the voter suppression. So if he's going to do this now, people become suspicious. You are now preaching peace so that, you'll be able to rule. But it doesn't work that way. He already came to, if the courts affirm his election, he already has a big problem of probably a long drawn-out religious, issue, and you are putting ethnic mix into it. He's going to come out. He's already coming to office, if he's affirmed, with a big legitimacy crisis. So that leadership, that letter he wrote, conciliatory as it was, ought to have come earlier. Because I'm talking about Bola Tinubu, not just because he's the only one that is, but because now he's the president-elect. He is now the man to be able to show the lead by the way you restrain Some of your over anxious lieutenants, some of them doing it just to be noticed for a political appointment. So it's politics of consequence. Whatever we do, there are consequences, and you have to go beyond to start to placate. And I'm more in tune with what Sanwo-Olu has done. His manner of approach, I think, was from the first time he issued statement. That is more reconciliatory. That, for me, it's more credible than sitting behind and believing that, okay, because I'm beneficiary of this situation, I can now call for peace. So we need to be able to offer justice to those that were hurt, and that's across the country, not just in Lagos alone, and make sure that those who perpetrated acts of violence, voter suppression, intimidation, ethnic profiling, not just one way, across, that they are fished out and punished, so that people will know that there are consequences for irresponsible behavior.
One of the things that some have described as part of the lessons that have come out of this process is that there is still a lot more to be done with reference to voter education. A number of the activities, the shenanigans that went on because perhaps people were not completely conscious of what exactly they could demand and what exactly their roles were in the process, and how the performance or non-performance of those roles could affect the outcome of the process. I give you an example which we discussed during the course of the election cycle itself. The role of polling agents. You talked about them in relation to cost, the cost of paying them to be part of the process or to monitor the elections on behalf of political parties. But then that introduced the element of the transaction. In other climes, polling agents are card-carrying members of political parties who are doing this under this, volunteerism cadre or any of that, and therefore there seems to be more commitment. A number of infractions have gone unreported and unnoticed because the polling agent who was supposed to be monitoring was nowhere to be found, or had in fact been compromised by the process. So a lot of education, both for the voter and for the political parties, are needed. That's what, another one of the lessons that is being itemized now.
I agree with you, but education is one of several elements. It's also a reflection of Nigerian environment. I mean, those people, they did not fall from the moon. Most or many Nigerians, from the policeman who stands on the checkpoint to the gate man who opens the gate for you, they are, permit me to use the term, they seem to have a price tag. And that was why I was suggesting something like private companies investing in the process. If, for example, it is allowed by our laws that you have private companies at every representative of private companies at various polling units, and that these private companies have their own servers, and that they are also uploading results simultaneously as INEC does its own, we can then use them to cross-check. So you can, if you have about 2 or 3 companies doing that, there will be competition. Some of the companies will want to upload at real time. That is, as you vote, it comes up the system. And then, now, instead of parties going straight to pay polling agents and transport them, it becomes the responsibility of private firms, the private companies, to transport their workers and be there and be able to transmit. They know, for example, that for them to continue to exist, they have to, be credible. So if people regard them as credible, then they will continue to pay them to use their services. If we start with about 3 companies, or companies that are accredited, and they're able to, go to be present at every polling unit, so that only parties that want to can send their own party agents. And these companies can represent whoever pays them, because they are uploading the results. Once you pay them, they'll give you access so that you'll be seeing the results in real time. And in that way, the idea now of snatching or tampering with the results at the end Because now that's what happens. The rigging takes place now mostly. Either you snatch the ballot box to destroy areas where you think is not the strength of your preferred candidate, or you snatch the paper. Remember, this is done manually. What is uploaded is simply a photograph. So you just snatch it and change the figures. And if what we are being shown on the internet is true, then we have seen several instances where the figures were changed. So you can imagine when we have about 3 credible companies, INEC itself will be under pressure because your own figures have to tally with the figures of the other companies. And if you're a company that is known for, not living up to expectations, parties will no longer patronize you. And the ones that are fit and credible enough will survive. And that will change the dynamics. It will lower the cost for the parties. At the same time, it will create employment for a private company or private companies.
Given that, let me bring you to something, because someone asked me about this and mentioned who is watching the watchdogs, and that brought up the issue of the media. In this election cycle, the media has also been in the spotlight, and not, altogether for the right reasons on several occasions. And when I say media, I'm talking about the umbrella of all media organizations. Now, as you observe the information management processes and the information dissemination processes of the media and how the media has covered this election, what would you say has been its position? Has it played a salutary role, or has its role been, perhaps not altogether complementary?
One of the good things with our media is that there are different private owners. Even if you suspect that one media is biased towards one party, there are others that are also biased towards the others. In other words, they countervail and cancel one another. So nobody can come around and say because the media is, the owner of the media is leaning towards this political party, therefore we write off the media. There are countervailing, they countervail and they cancel, because it makes sure that no one narrative will dominate the political ecosystem. So if you are a media house, no matter how biased you are, you can only purvey one perspective or one narrative. Another one will, purvey a different narrative. But on the whole, I think the major media houses, they've done very well. They've been able to invite people from different angles, and I think it is actually the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation that, in my own opinion, I feel is, too eager to please on what he wants to categorize as not being as fair comment and not fair comment. And sometimes one gets the impression that he goes strongly after media houses that it perceives to be against the government. So other than that, I think this is the way the media houses should be. Even in the US, if you go to New York Times, you can say, oh, he's leaning towards this time. If you go to CNN or to others, people will always talk about their leanings. In fact, in both UK and the US, media houses endorse candidates, and it does not remove the fact that they are vibrant. Because when you endorse one candidate that is from Party A, there is also another big media house that is endorsing another candidate that's from Party B. So in that way, the narratives countervail and they cancel one another.
Let's talk about disinformation, which is the other aspect of this, and misinformation. A lot of that went on during this election campaign, as we saw and as we reported and as we talked about, including with people like your distinguished self, people putting out what they knew were lies, but they had ulterior motives for doing so, particularly online, using the social media, which again was making more or less like a debut in this election cycle. So I want you to talk a bit about that too. How did they perform? They played a very big role in this election.
Yeah, you're right. But even then, people say truth is, what you call truth is relative. And it has time and space dimension. If you move from one geographic area to another, what is true may change. And that is why Donald Trump's mind has talked about alternative facts. They didn't want to say president was lying. I call them alternative facts.
Absolutely.
So you can also use that angle to fight that disinformation. Of course, in several countries now, including in the Western world, they are taking legal measures, some measures to make sure that the whole issue of disinformation and misinformation are curtailed. But you can't remove them. What they do, that you use social media influencers, the same perspective you want to push out. You use the same channel they are using. But governments are disadvantaged in this, because the distrust of government is one of the things that propels free speech, because there's inherent distrust that if you allow the government to monopolize or even to define the trajectory of free speech, we will lose it all. So we cannot do much. For example, I think the European Union, if they find out that is an disinformation, you are given some time immediately to remove the information and correct it. In some others, there is a punishment. And what we have to find, the balance has always been, what do we do so that we do not preempt speech, that we do not use censorship, so people are not afraid of expressing their opinion, that is, prior restraint. And of course, some people say under the military that, well, I can allow you free speech, but I don't know what happens after you have expressed your free speech. So is that tension that people are going to try to find a way of manage? But we cannot. This is the era we are living. It's the era, you can call it social media. Others say it is a period of democratizing speech, whether it is through media convergence, where before you need to be a big-time media entrepreneur to run a television station. These days, somebody who is very savvy, has access to YouTube channels, can also start running his own TV stations online. So you propagate your own version of truth, the person propagates his or her own version of truth. And that's why they talk, instead of calling it lies, and they say it's a sort of alternative facts. There are still a number of organizations, the Center for Democracy and Development, one of them, pushing that people should cross-check their facts. That's part of the education you talked about. You have to think of the information you got, look at the source, is it credible before you forward. Sometimes people really know that the information they are forwarding is not credible, but they do it all the same in order to be able to negate or balance another perspective that is gaining currency somewhere else.
Indeed. Let's use the time left for us, Professor Adibe, to now look ahead, not in the sense of moving ahead that the politicians say, but looking ahead in the sense of where the country goes from here. Now, those who have been declared winners and those who have not been declared winners, the courts will decide ultimately if the decisions were right or wrong. But then the country has existential challenges, which it still nevertheless has to deal with, from the mundane to the outright, compelling. So if we are to set some kind of agenda now for those who are coming in, the new men of power, if you like, and women, if eventually any one of them turns out to be a woman, what would that be? What are the things that they should now be looking at? Obviously, security will be number one if I were in a position to mention one. But what would be your own priority list?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say that in 2012, at just the beginning of, at the height of the Boko Haram insurgency, I was invited by the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, and what they asked me is to provide a theoretical understanding of that phenomenon. And my argument at that time was that it is a reflection of the crisis in our nation-building process, in which several groups and individuals were delinking from the state and then regarding the state as an enemy. And that it's not different. My argument then was that what happened then, what we regard as Boko Haram, delinking from the state, was not materially different from the policeman who looked the other way, at a little inducement, or the ordinary Nigerians who just believe that this government is not my father's work, and it's regarded as an act of heroism to go and, if you can plunder the state and bring a lot of money, and then you bring it to your village and maybe use it to give a scholarship, like in the manner of Robin Hood, then you're a hero. We have to look at the reasons why people are delinking from the state. We have to look at the reasons why there is no institution capable of commanding legitimacy across our fault lines. Unless we're able to do that, basically to rethink our nation-building process. It is a simple word, but it's very complicated when we come down to it, because it encompasses all these problems we've mentioned, from Lagos to Kano to Anambra and others, to issue of banditry. Why is it that we don't have faith in our institutions? Why is it there's no individual that is capable of commanding legitimacy across the fault lines in this country? And as we try to get closer to the answer, we have to then believe that we need to find a way of rethinking our nation-building process. And I do not believe that it is about saying, let us forget the past and move on. There should be consequences for people who have done outrageous things. And we don't move forward. People need justice. People need to know that there are consequences for bad behavior, and that those who believe in the system and follow logically the system are not mugus, and that there's a reward for being a good Nigerian. And that's what I think we should be aiming. It's not just to believe that because I'm a beneficiary of a faulty system, I say to everybody, let's move ahead. And before you know it, we get a lot of media people who will be, breathing down our nose and calling us all sorts of names if we do not believe in the government agenda. So this is the kind of things where both the critic and the person pretending to be, the defender of a certain principle, the best defender, we all probably have the same interest for our country to work. We all believe that if the country is working, everybody will be happy. But how can it work if people are becoming increasingly alienated from the system, increasingly alienated from the state? At the root of all these separatist agitations, banditry, call it Boko Haram and the rest of them, is the issue that people believe that the state has failed them. And we have to find a way to rebuild confidence in the state. We have to find a way of, respecting and honoring Nigerians, no matter their stations of life, that have played by the rules and that are making us proud. These are the people we should be looking up to, not gangsters who have come upon money. You use the gangsterism to get power, and then you think after becoming, capturing power through gangsterism, then gangsterism will disappear. No, the same thing you brood, the same thing will come after you.
I cannot let you go, Professor Adibe, without asking about the situation in the Southeast. Leading up to this election, many people believed that there would be no elections in the Southeast. But surprisingly, in spite of those predictions, the elections took place. There's a lot of contention. Even as you and I speak here, there are still some results that are outstanding. But the elections took place. And even though there were pockets of violence, they weren't like anything that was expected. To what do you attribute that? And do you think that now that prediction didn't come to pass, perhaps the Southeast will return to some sort of normalcy?
I'm not sure if it will return, but let me say that I really commend our security agencies, because sometimes they do more work that we give them credit. And I think it was to their credit that the elections took place, because if they had listen to the voice of people that said there will be no election, then they are conferring more legitimacy on those people, and then they are giving more credence to the fact that, or to a certain belief that the state is not in total control of its territory. Remember, that's one of the prerequisites of being a state, that you should be able to have control of your territory. So it is a good thing that election took place in the southeast and in the northwest, where you have serious problem of banditry, in the northeast where you have Boko Haram and ISWAP. And I think we should really give our security agencies, credit. I also think that this hope, there's a new hope, and I believe that a number of people that delinked or were delinking from the Nigerian state suddenly saw, and that's only a conjecture, the acceptance of P2B across the country as, negating their own belief that, Igbos, there's a glass ceiling to which an Igbo man should not aspire beyond. That acceptance must have debunked or challenged some of the narratives, some of the beliefs of the young people there who believe that, there's no plan, there's no hope for us in this entity. So if these people can really, people can across the country, can, make one of their own a moral icon, a moral, no matter, irrespective of people's opinion, they will always tell you P2B is a good man. If people across the country could take him that way, then the whole idea that nobody will like us, that there is a glass ceiling beyond which we cannot go, is challenged. And that is irrespective of whether he wins or not, is that a certain myth, a certain narrative has been challenged. That for me also probably is one of the reasons why, those who were clamoring for that election should not take place, because people were actually also challenging them. The sentiment on the ground was seriously against any kind of sentiment that the election should not take place. And that in itself is a demonstration of faith in the Nigerian entity.
Indeed it was. And it's on that positive and optimistic note that I want to thank you, Professor Jideofor Adibe, for your time on the program today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much, my brother.
That's our program today. We would, of course, like to hear from you on the conversation. Our social media handles are right there on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program via our podcast. Please visit our website, channelstv.com, to get started. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Goodbye.